Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly complex and occasionally absurd life of medieval monks. What did these devoted men actually do all day? Turns out it wasn't just praying and copying manuscripts in perfect silence, though there was plenty of both. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The average day for a medieval monk began at what most of us would consider an ungodly hour. Literally, Matins, the first prayer service of the day, started around 2 a.m., sometimes earlier depending on the season and the particular monastery's schedule. Yes, 2 a.m., while you were deep in REM sleep. Brother Thomas was stumbling through stone corridors in the pitch black, trying not to trip over his own habit. Sleep in a monastery wasn't the cozy affair you might imagine. Monks slept in dormitories, long, cold rooms lined with simple beds that were basically wooden frames with straw mattresses. Privacy was a foreign concept. Everyone heard everything. Snoring, coughing, the occasional nightmare about being chased by demons. And yes, the more earthly bodily functions that happen when you eat a lot of beans and cabbage. The beds were narrow, hard, and designed to discourage comfort. The theory was that physical discomfort brought you closer to God, though it mostly just brought chronic back pain. Blankets were thin and scratchy, usually made from coarse wool that felt like sleeping under a hair shirt, which, incidentally, some monks actually did wear as penance. When that first bell rang for matins, there was no snooze button, no rolling over for 5 more minutes. You got up immediately, in the dark, in whatever weather was happening outside those stone walls. Winter mornings were particularly brutal. Imagine being jolted awake at 2 a.m. when it's 30 degrees inside your dormitory, and you have to walk across freezing stone floors in bare feet or thin sandals. The monks would shuffle into the chapel, still half asleep, breath visible in the cold air, and begin the first of 8 prayer services they'd complete before the day was over. Matins lasted about an hour, filled with psalms, readings, and chants that echoed through the stone chambers. Your voice had to work whether you were ready or not, and trust me, 2 a.m. voices were not at their finest. After matins, there was a brief return to bed, maybe 2 hours if they were lucky, before lauds at dawn. This wasn't really enough sleep for anyone, which explains why so many medieval manuscripts have notes in the margins like tired, or my hand is killing me, or occasionally just random doodles that suggest the scribe's mind had wandered somewhere more interesting. Personal hygiene in a monastery existed, but it was complicated by religious doctrine and practical limitations. Cleanliness was considered important for spiritual purity, but vanity was a sin. So you had to walk a fine line between being clean and caring too much about being clean. Bathing happened, but not often. Most monasteries had bath schedules, maybe once a week, sometimes less. The bathhouse was usually a communal affair, which meant everyone got to see exactly how committed their brothers were to their vows of poverty, including in areas where poverty was more obvious. Water was heated in large cauldrons, and monks took turns in the same water. By the time Brother Francis got his turn, he was basically marinating in the accumulated grime of a dozen other men. Soap existed but was considered a luxury in many places. More often, monks used sand, ash, or just hot water and vigorous scrubbing. Hair care was simpler because most monks had tonsures, that distinctive bald patch on top of their heads that marked them as clergy. Regular monks shaved the crown of their head, leaving a ring of hair around the sides, which looked exactly as attractive as it sounds. This required regular maintenance with very sharp razors and steady hands, or you'd end up looking like you'd had a fight with a very aggressive beaver. Shaving was done by other monks, which meant trusting Brother Benedict with a razor near your scalp. After he'd been up since 2 a.m. and had minimal training in barbering, accidents happened, and they hurt a lot. Teeth were cleaned with twigs, cloth, or just fingers. Dental hygiene wasn't exactly advanced, and the monastic diet didn't help matters. Lots of bread meant lots of carbohydrates sticking to teeth, and sugar, while rare, was sometimes available, leading to the kind of dental problems that made chewing an adventure. Clothing was standardized and practical, but not comfortable. The habit, that long robe that's become iconic, was made from coarse wool or linen, depending on the monastery's resources and rules. It was hot in summer, barely warm enough in winter, and always scratchy. Monks wore it every day, for everything, which meant it got filthy and stayed that way until wash day. Undergarments were minimal. Many monks wore simple linen shirts beneath their habits, but underwear as we know it didn't exist. This created some interesting challenges, especially during long prayer services where shifting positions was discouraged. Feet were often bare or covered in simple sandals, even in winter. Frostbite was common, and permanently cold feet were just part of the job. Some monasteries allowed socks or foot wrappings in extreme weather, but comfort was always secondary to spiritual discipline. The smell of a medieval monastery was distinctive. Combine unwashed wool clothing that rarely got cleaned, communal living spaces with poor ventilation, and the various odors from cooking, livestock, and primitive sanitation, and you get an aromatic experience that would send modern people running for the hills. But here's the interesting part. Everyone smelled roughly the same, so it was just background noise. You only really noticed if someone smelled significantly better or worse than the norm. Better might mean they'd been sneaking extra baths. Worse might mean they were sick or had been working in the pig pens. After Lord's at dawn, the day's real work began. Contrary to popular belief, monks didn't spend all day praying. Prayer was scheduled throughout the day, but between services, there was a tremendous amount of work to be done. Monasteries were self-sufficient communities that needed to produce their own food, maintain their buildings, create their own tools, and often support the surrounding community as well. The work assignments were based on skill, physical ability, and sometimes just whoever was available when something needed doing. Some monks were scribes, copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, a job that required excellent handwriting, attention to detail, and the ability to sit hunched over a desk for hours without going completely insane. Other monks worked in the kitchen, which was hot, chaotic, and dangerous. Medieval cooking involved open fires, heavy pots, sharp knives, and ingredients that might or might not be fresh. Kitchen monks got up even earlier than everyone else to start bread baking and meal preparation. They also dealt with the constant challenge of feeding dozens or hundreds of people with limited ingredients and no refrigeration. Some monks worked in the fields, growing grain, vegetables, and tending livestock. This was physical labor that left you exhausted, dirty, and sometimes injured. Farming with medieval tools was back-breaking work, and monks did it in their wool habits, which meant they were constantly overheated, scratched up by rough fabric, and probably dealing with some very creative chafing. Others worked in workshops, making tools, shoes, pottery, or other necessities. Blacksmithing monks worked with fire and metal, constantly risking burns and breathing smoke. Carpenter monks built furniture, repaired buildings, and occasionally fell off ladders. Every trade had its occupational hazards, and there was no workers' compensation if you injured yourself making horseshoes for the monastery's donkey. The monastery's economy was complex. They had to be self-sufficient, but they also engaged in trade with the outside world. Many monasteries became wealthy through efficient farming, skilled craftsmanship, or strategic location along trade routes. Some monks were essentially medieval businessmen, negotiating deals, managing finances, and making decisions that affected the entire community's survival. Breakfast, if it happened at all, was simple and quick. Many monastic rules included fasting requirements that meant skipping the morning meal entirely, especially during certain seasons or holy periods. When breakfast was allowed, it might be leftover bread from the previous day, perhaps with some ale or watered wine, and maybe some cheese if the monastery was doing well. The main meal of the day was dinner, served around noon after the morning work period and the sex prayer service. This was when the community gathered in the refectory, the dining hall, for their primary sustenance, and one of the few times when the entire community was together outside of prayer. Monastic meals followed strict rules. Someone read aloud during the meal, usually religious texts, lives of saints, or scriptures, while everyone else ate in silence. This meant you couldn't ask someone to pass the salt, complain about the food, or make conversation about your day. You ate what was served, listened to the reading, and tried not to choke on tough bread, while concentrating on spiritual improvement. The food itself was simple but surprisingly varied, depending on the monastery's location and resources. Bread was the staple, dark, heavy, and filling. Vegetables were common: beans, peas, onions, leeks, cabbage, and whatever grew locally. Eggs were available when the chickens were laying. cheese when the cows were producing, and meat on special occasions, or for sick monks who needed extra nutrition. Fish was more common than meat, especially during the many fasting periods throughout the year. Monks became creative with fish preparation, developing recipes that made the most of whatever was available locally. Coastal monasteries had access to sea fish, while inland communities relied on rivers, ponds, or fish farming in monastery ponds. Ale or watered wine was the standard drink because water quality was unpredictable. Monks weren't supposed to get drunk, but they needed safe liquids, and fermented beverages were often the most reliable option. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing skills, creating ales that were sought after by the surrounding community. Portion control was built into monastic life through religious discipline, but also through practical limitations. Food was expensive and sometimes scarce. Everyone got enough to survive and work, but no one got enough to become fat and lazy. Gluttony was a sin, and besides, there often wasn't enough food for gluttony to be an option. Special diets existed for sick monks, elderly brothers who couldn't digest tough food, and sometimes for monks doing particularly physical labor. The infirmary had its own kitchen where softer foods, broths, and occasionally even meat were prepared for those who needed extra nutrition to recover from illness or injury. After dinner, there was usually a brief rest period, maybe an hour before the afternoon work began. This wasn't a siesta, it was just a chance to digest food and prepare for the second work period of the day. Some monks used this time to study, others to maintain their personal belongings, and a few probably used it to sneak in a quick nap, despite rules against laziness. The afternoon work period lasted until Vespers, the evening prayer service, usually held around sunset. This work period was often more focused and intensive than the morning session, because everyone knew the day was winding down and tasks needed to be completed. For scribes, this meant racing to finish copying pages before the light failed. Medieval manuscripts were copied by hand, letter by letter, in conditions that would give modern office workers nightmares. The scripts were tiny, the ink had to be mixed fresh, and mistakes meant starting over or carefully scraping away errors with knives. Illuminated manuscripts, those with decorative borders and illustrations, required additional skills in drawing, painting, and gold leaf application. Monks who specialized in this work were artists as well as scribes, creating books that were both functional and beautiful. The pressure was enormous because a single mistake could ruin weeks of work. For field workers, afternoon meant completing whatever agricultural tasks the season demanded: plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, or processing crops, all done with hand tools and animal power. Monks working in the fields developed the same calluses, back problems, and weather-beaten appearance as any medieval farmer. Kitchen monks spent the afternoon preparing supper and planning the next day's meals. This involved not just cooking, but managing supplies, calculating portions for the entire community, and dealing with the logistics of feeding large numbers of people with limited storage and preservation methods. The monastery's business operations also continued through the afternoon. Monks managing the community's finances, trade relationships, and external obligations had to balance spiritual duties with practical necessities. They corresponded with other monasteries, negotiated with local merchants, managed tenant farmers on monastery lands, and handled the complex legal and financial arrangements that kept their community solvent. Vespers marked the end of the workday and the beginning of the evening's spiritual focus. This prayer service was longer and more elaborate than some of the earlier ones, with more complex chants and readings. By this time, everyone was tired from a full day of physical and mental labor, but they still had to stand through an hour or more of religious observance. After Vespers came supper, which was lighter than dinner, but still governed by the same rules of silence and spiritual reading. The food was usually simpler: bread, leftover vegetables, perhaps some fruit if it was in season. Ale or wine continued to be the standard beverage, though in smaller quantities than at dinner. The evening was also time for additional study, meditation, or spiritual reading. Monks were expected to continue their religious education throughout their lives, reading scripture, theological works, and lives of saints. This was done individually or in small groups, often by candlelight or oil lamps that provided minimal illumination and constantly threatened to set things on fire. Personal maintenance also happened in the evening. Monks mended their habits, maintained their tools, organized their few personal possessions, and prepared for the next day's work. This was also when they might engage in private prayer or spiritual exercises beyond the communal services. The monastery's infirmary was busiest in the evening, as monks dealt with the day's accumulation of injuries, illnesses, and chronic problems. Medieval medicine was limited, but monasteries often had some of the best medical knowledge available. Monk physicians treated everything from minor cuts and bruises to serious diseases, using herbal remedies, basic surgery, and a lot of prayer. Common problems included back injuries from heavy lifting, cuts from sharp tools, burns from kitchen work, respiratory problems from dusty conditions, and the various infections and diseases that flourished in communal living situations. Eye strain was common among scribes, arthritis among older monks, and digestive problems among everyone who ate the monastery's challenging diet. Some monasteries specialized in medical care, running hospitals or hospices for the surrounding community. These monks developed expertise in treating specific conditions, preparing medicines, and managing healthcare for both religious and secular patients. It was demanding work that required both medical knowledge and spiritual strength to deal with suffering and death. Compline, the final prayer service of the day, usually began around 8 or 9 p.m., depending on the season. This was the most solemn service, preparing the community for sleep and the spiritual dangers of the night. Medieval people believed that nighttime was when evil forces were most active, so Compline included prayers for protection and safe rest. After Clifton began the Great Silence, a period from evening until after the first morning service, when speech was forbidden except in emergencies. This wasn't just about quiet. It was about creating a spiritual atmosphere where monks could focus on prayer, meditation, and communion with God without worldly distractions. The Great Silence meant that any evening activities had to be conducted without conversation. Monks communicated through established hand signals if necessary, but mostly they simply worked alone. This could be peaceful for those who enjoyed solitude, but it was also isolating for monks who were naturally social or who were struggling with personal problems. Returning to the dormitory for the night meant preparing for another cycle of interrupted sleep. Monks went to bed knowing they'd be awakened in a few hours for mass. Then again, for lords, creating a sleep pattern that would be considered torture by modern standards. Chronic fatigue was just part of monastic life. The dormitory at night was filled with the sounds of dozens of men trying to sleep in close quarters, snoring, coughing, shifting on uncomfortable beds, and the occasional sleep-talking created a constant background noise. Some monks developed the ability to sleep through anything, while others became permanently light sleepers who woke at every sound. Temperature control was minimal. Stone buildings stayed cold in winter and hot in summer, with little ability to regulate comfort. Monks slept in their undergarments or sometimes in lighter versions of their habits, covered by whatever blankets were available. Frostbite in winter and heat exhaustion in summer were real dangers. Personal space was limited to your bed and perhaps a small chest for belongings. Privacy for personal hygiene, changing clothes, or dealing with illness was virtually non-existent. Everything was communal, which meant everyone knew everyone else's business, health problems, and personal habits. The cycle of monastic life was broken by special occasions, feast days, and seasonal changes that brought variety to the routine. Major religious holidays meant altered schedules, special foods, and sometimes relaxed rules about silence or fasting. These breaks were eagerly anticipated and carefully celebrated within the bounds of religious propriety. Christmas, Easter, and other major feasts brought better food, longer prayer services, and sometimes entertainment like religious plays or musical performances. The monastery's best vestments and ceremonial objects were brought out. Candles and incense were used more liberally, and the community celebrated with as much joy as their vows allowed. Seasonal changes affected every aspect of monastic life. Spring meant planting, longer daylight hours, and the end of winter's isolation. Summer brought intense agricultural work, better food as fresh produce became available, and the challenges of working in hot weather while wearing heavy wool robes. Autumn was harvest time, with long days of physical labor to gather and process crops that would sustain the community through winter. This was also when monasteries prepared for the lean months ahead, preserving food, repairing buildings, and stockpiling supplies. Winter brought its own challenges. Shorter days that limited work hours, cold that made everything more difficult, and the constant struggle to maintain warmth and health in buildings that were barely heated. Monks developed chilblains, respiratory infections, and the depression that comes from months of grey skies and limited sunlight. The social dynamics within a monastery were complex and sometimes tense. Despite vows of humility and brotherhood, monks were human beings with different personalities, backgrounds, and ambitions. Some were naturally suited to communal life, while others struggled with the lack of privacy and personal autonomy. Leadership positions within the monastery, abbot, prior, and various administrative roles were sources of both respect and conflict. These positions carried real power over daily life, work assignments, and discipline, which meant politics existed even in communities dedicated to spiritual transcendence. Some monks were educated nobles who had chosen religious life, while others were former peasants seeking better opportunities. These class differences didn't disappear at the monastery gates, and they influenced how monks related to each other and how work was distributed. Personality conflicts were inevitable when dozens of men lived in close quarters with no escape from each other. Some monks were naturally cheerful and easy to live with, while others were irritable, demanding, or just difficult. The rules of monastic life helped manage these conflicts, but they couldn't eliminate human nature. Mental health challenges were common but poorly understood. Monks dealing with depression, anxiety, or other psychological problems had few resources beyond prayer and the hope that spiritual discipline would solve their difficulties. Some found peace in monastic life, while others suffered in silence or acted out in ways that disrupted the community. The monastery's relationship with the outside world was complex and constantly evolving. While monks were supposed to be separated from worldly concerns, they couldn't completely isolate themselves from the economic, political, and social forces that shaped medieval life. Many monasteries owned extensive lands worked by tenant farmers who owed rent, labor, or portions of their crops to the religious community. Managing these relationships required monks to engage in business activities that sometimes conflicted with spiritual ideals about poverty and detachment from material concerns. Monasteries also served their local communities as centers of learning, medical care, and spiritual guidance. Local people came to monastery churches for services, brought their children for education, and sought help during times of crisis. This service role meant that monks had to balance their own spiritual needs with the practical demands of their neighbors. Political relationships were unavoidable. Monasteries were often wealthy and influential, which meant they became involved in local and regional politics whether they wanted to or not. Abbots were frequently nobles who maintained connections to powerful families, and monastery resources were sometimes used to support political causes or military actions. Education was one of the monastery's most important functions, both for monks and for the broader community. The monastery school taught reading, writing, Latin, mathematics, and theology to young monks and sometimes to local children from wealthy families. Teaching was demanding work that required not just knowledge, but patience and skill in managing young people who weren't necessarily eager to learn. Monk teachers used methods that would seem harsh by modern standards: physical punishment for failures, rote memorization, and strict discipline. But they produced some of the most educated people in medieval society. The monastery library was often the most extensive collection of books in the region, containing not just religious texts, but also classical literature, scientific works, historical chronicles, and practical manuals. Maintaining this library required careful preservation of fragile cataloging systems to track hundreds or thousands of books, and the constant work of copying texts to replace damaged volumes. Scribes working in the monastery's scriptorium were often the most skilled craftsmen in the community, producing books that were works of art as well as repositories of knowledge. The process of creating a single illuminated manuscript could take months or years, requiring expertise in writing, illustration, and book. The daily routine of scriptorial work was demanding and precise. Scribes had to maintain consistent letter formation across hundreds of pages, calculate spacing to make text fit properly, and avoid mistakes that would require starting over. The physical demands included hours of hunched posture, eye strain from working in poor light, and hand cramps from gripping pens for extended periods. Monastery workshops produced goods both for internal use and for trade with the outside world. Skilled monk craftsmen made tools, furniture, pottery, textiles, and other necessities that supported the community's self-sufficiency, while also generating income through sales to local markets. These workshops were training centers where older monks passed skills to younger brothers maintaining traditions of craftsmanship that might otherwise be lost. The quality of monastery-produced goods was often exceptionally high, because monks had time to perfect their techniques and took pride in creating items that reflected their dedication to excellence in all things. The monastery's agricultural operations were sophisticated enterprises that required knowledge of crop rotation, animal husbandry, soil management, and weather patterns. Monk farmers developed expertise that made monastery lands some of the most productive in their regions. Livestock management was particularly challenging, requiring monks to care for cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, and sometimes horses or oxen used for heavy work. Animals needed daily attention regardless of whether religious observances or other priorities, which meant some monks were always on duty, even during the most solemn religious periods. Food, preservation, and storage were critical skills that determined whether the monastery community would eat well or go hungry during lean periods. Monks developed techniques for smoking meat, making cheese, brewing ale, drying vegetables, and storing grain that kept food safe and nutritious for months. The monastery's economic activities sometimes created ethical dilemmas. Business success conflicted with spiritual values, charging interest on loans, engaging in aggressive trade practices, or exploiting workers could increase monastery wealth, but contradicted teachings about charity and justice. Some monasteries became so wealthy that they lost sight of their spiritual mission, focusing more on accumulating riches than on serving God and their communities. This corruption led to reform movements that tried to return monastic life to its original principles of poverty, humility, and service. The physical demands of monastic life took a toll on health and longevity that varied depending on individual assignments and overall monastery conditions. Monks doing heavy physical labor aged quickly and often suffered from chronic injuries, while those in sedentary roles like scribing developed their own health problems from poor posture and limited exercise. Diet-related health issues were common due to limited variety, seasonal shortages, and the challenge of maintaining nutrition while observing frequent fasting requirements. Vitamin deficiencies, digestive problems, and malnutrition affected many monks, particularly during harsh winters or years of poor harvests. Communicable diseases spread rapidly in the close quarters of monastery dormitories and dining halls. Respiratory infections, skin conditions, and parasitic infestations were constant concerns that require careful management to prevent community-wide outbreaks that could devastate the population. Mental health challenges were particularly difficult in an environment valued conformity and obedience over individual expression. Monks struggling with depression, anxiety, or other psychological problems had limited options for treatment and often suffered in isolation. The monastery's medical care was provided by monks who had learned healing arts through apprenticeship, study of medical texts, or trial and error. Their treatments combined herbal remedies, basic surgery, spiritual counseling, and hope, achieving varying degrees of success. Some monasteries developed reputations for medical expertise and attracted patients from surrounding regions. These communities invested in medical libraries, herb gardens, and specialized facilities that made them centers of healthcare innovation within the limitations of medieval knowledge. The end of monastic life came through death, departure, or expulsion, each carrying its own spiritual and practical implications. Monks who died in the monastery were considered blessed, having completed their earthly service within the community that had supported their spiritual journey. Death in the monastery was treated as a community event, with elaborate rituals, prayers, and ceremonies that honored the deceased while reminding survivors of their own mortality. The funeral process could last for days and involve the entire community in mourning, celebration, and reflection. Some monks left monastic life voluntarily, though this was difficult and sometimes impossible depending on the vows they had taken and the rules of their particular order. Those who departed faced the challenge of readjusting to secular life after years of structured religious routine. Expulsion from the monastery was rare, but occurred when monks committed serious crimes, repeatedly violated essential rules, or proved unable to adapt to communal life. Expelled monks faced stigma and practical difficulties in finding alternative livelihoods, making dismissal from the community a severe punishment. The legacy of monastic life extended far beyond the monastery walls through the preservation of knowledge, development of agricultural techniques, advancement of medical practice, and creation of artistic works that enriched medieval culture and continued to influence modern society. Monasteries served as centers of learning that maintained classical texts, developed new theological and philosophical ideas, and educated generations of leaders who shaped medieval politics, economics, and intellectual life. The scholarly work done in monastery libraries and schools laid foundations for later developments in universities and scientific advancement. The agricultural innovations developed in monastery farms improved food production throughout medieval Europe, introducing new crops, farming techniques, and land management practices that increased yields and supported population growth. Monastic medical practices advanced understanding of anatomy, disease treatment, and pharmaceutical preparation while providing healthcare services to communities that might otherwise have had no access to trained healers. The artistic achievements of monastery workshops and scriptoriums created illuminated architectural innovations and decorative arts that represent some of the finest cultural productions of the medieval period. So there you have it, the surprisingly complex, occasionally ridiculous, and always demanding life of medieval monks. From the 2 a.m. wake-up calls to the political maneuvering, from the sublime spiritual experiences to the very earthly challenges of communal living, monastic life was far more varied and human than the stereotypes suggest. These men chose a path that required enormous sacrifice and discipline, but they also created communities that preserved knowledge, advanced human understanding, and provided models of cooperation and service that continue to inspire people today. Whether they were copying manuscripts by candlelight, tending sick neighbors, or simply trying to stay warm during yet another freezing winter morning service, monks were living out their beliefs in ways that shaped the world around them. Next time you complain about your morning alarm, remember Brother Thomas stumbling through those dark corridors at 2 a.m., ready to begin another day of service, labor, and devotion. The monks may not have had comfortable beds or reliable central heating, but they built something that lasted far longer than their individual lives. Communities of purpose that changed the world, one prayer, one copied page, and one act of service at a time. The spiritual life of monks wasn't just about showing up to prayer services and going through the motions. Genuine spiritual development required intense personal discipline, constant self-examination, and the kind of mental focus that would challenge even the most dedicated modern meditators. This was psychological work that could be more exhausting than physical labor. Personal prayer and meditation happened throughout the day, not just during official services. Monks were expected to maintain an attitude of prayer even while working, turning routine tasks into opportunities for spiritual reflection. This meant trying to keep your mind focused on God while mucking out pig stalls, copying the same Latin text for the 100th time, or dealing with a particularly annoying brother who chewed too loudly during meals. The concept of lectio divina, divine reading, was central to monastic spirituality. This involved slowly reading and meditating on scripture, not just to understand the words, but to experience a personal encounter with God through the text. It sounds peaceful until you realize it meant sitting still for hours, concentrating intensely on passages you'd read hundreds of times before, trying to find new meaning while your back ached and your stomach growled. Confession was regular and thorough. Monks didn't just confess major sins, they were expected to examine their consciences daily and admit to thoughts, feelings, and minor actions that might indicate spiritual problems. This created a culture of intense self-scrutiny that could be spiritually beneficial or psychologically damaging, depending on the individual monk's personality and mental health. Some monks experienced genuine mystical encounters, visions, ecstatic experiences, or profound spiritual insights that convinced them they were truly in communion with the divine. Others spent decades waiting for such experiences that never came, wondering if there were spiritual failures, or if God had simply chosen different paths for their spiritual development. The pressure to be holy was constant and sometimes overwhelming. Monks were supposed to be examples of Christian virtue, which meant controlling not just their actions, but their thoughts and emotions. Anger, lust, pride, envy, and other normal human feelings were sins to be conquered, not natural responses to be managed. This spiritual perfectionism led some monks to extreme practices: excessive fasting, self-flagellation, sleeping on stones instead of straw, or deliberately seeking out the most unpleasant tasks as forms of penance. The line between spiritual discipline and self-destructive behavior was sometimes very thin. Prayer itself could become routine and meaningless if monks weren't careful. Saying the same words hundreds of times, attending services when you were exhausted or sick, and maintaining spiritual focus while dealing with practical concerns required constant effort. Some monks developed genuine spiritual depth, while others went through the motions, while their minds wandered to more interesting topics. The monastery's relationship with money created constant tension between spiritual ideals and practical necessities. Individual monks took vows of poverty, but the monastery as an institution often needed substantial wealth to survive and serve its community. This contradiction led to complex mental gymnastics as monks tried to reconcile their personal renunciation of material goods with their collective ownership of extensive lands, valuable libraries, and profitable enterprises. Some monasteries became incredibly wealthy through intelligent management, strategic investments, and generous donations from wealthy patrons. This success created new problems. How do you maintain humility while living in luxury? How do you serve the poor while accumulating riches? How do you focus on spiritual development when you're essentially running a medieval corporation? The politics of monastery finance were complex and sometimes dirty. Abbots had to negotiate with nobles, merchants, and church officials to protect their community's interests. This might involve making deals that compromised spiritual principles, supporting political causes they didn't personally endorse, or competing aggressively with other monasteries for resources and influence. Land management was particularly complicated. Monasteries owned vast estates, worked by tenant farmers who owed various forms of rent and service. Managing these relationships required business skills, legal knowledge, and sometimes the willingness to use force to collect debts or evict unproductive tenants. Not exactly the gentle, contemplative life many monks had expected when they took their vows. Some monks specialized in financial management, becoming medieval accountants who tracked income, expenses, investments, and debts with remarkable precision. These brothers developed sophisticated understanding of economics, law, and business practices that rivaled anything available in the secular world. The monastery's banking activities were especially controversial. Lending money at interest was considered usury and condemned by church teaching. But monasteries needed ways to generate income and communities needed access to credit. Creative financial arrangements allowed monasteries to profit from lending while technically avoiding the sin of usury. But these legal fictions didn't resolve the underlying ethical tensions. International trade brought additional complications. Monasteries that produced high-quality goods, wine, textiles, or crafted items could sell to markets across Europe, generating substantial profits, but also exposing the community to economic fluctuations, currency problems, and the moral hazards of competitive commerce. The monastic day was structured around the 8 canonical hours, specific times for prayer that divided each 24-hour period into manageable segments. But this schedule was based on Roman timekeeping that didn't account for seasonal variations in daylight, creating practical problems that medieval monks had to solve creatively. During summer, when days were long, the time between prayer services stretched out, allowing for extended work periods, but also creating fatigue as monks tried to maintain productivity during extended daylight hours. Winter brought the opposite problem: shortened days that compressed work time and made everything more difficult in the cold and darkness. The monastery bell system was crucial for coordinating community life. Someone had to maintain accurate timekeeping, ring bells at precise intervals, and ensure that all community members could hear the signals regardless of where they were working. This was harder than it sounds in an era without mechanical clocks, especially during storms or high winds that could muffle sound. Different monasteries developed different approaches to timekeeping. Some used water clocks, others relied on candle clocks that burned at predictable rates, and a few had access to primitive mechanical timepieces. All of these methods required constant attention and frequent adjustment, making the monastery timekeeper's job both important and stressful. The rhythm of monastic life was also disrupted by seasonal religious observances that altered normal schedules. Lent brought extended fasting, additional prayer services, and modified work routines. Holy Week involved elaborate ceremonies that required weeks of preparation and left everyone exhausted. Christmas and Easter seasons had their own special requirements that complicated the normal routine. Feast days of important saints often meant altered schedules, special foods, and community celebrations that broke the normal pattern of work and prayer. These occasions were eagerly anticipated, but also created additional work for kitchen staff, sacristans, and others responsible for organizing special events. The monastery's educational mission extended far beyond basic literacy and religious instruction. Advanced students studied theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law, creating centers of higher learning that rivaled and sometimes surpassed secular schools. Teaching theology required monks to master complex philosophical arguments, understand multiple interpretations of scripture, and guide students through intellectual challenges that could shake their faith or strengthen their understanding. This was demanding work that required both scholarly expertise and pastoral sensitivity. Philosophy instruction involved studying classical authors whose ideas sometimes conflicted with Christian doctrine. Monks had to help students appreciate Aristotle's logic or Plato's metaphysics while maintaining orthodox Christian beliefs, requiring intellectual flexibility and sophisticated reasoning skills. Mathematics and astronomy were essential for calculating the dates of religious festivals, which depended on complex lunar and solar cycles. Monks who specialized in these subjects developed expertise that made them valuable consultants for church authorities and secular rulers who needed accurate calendars. Medical instruction combined classical texts with practical experience gained from treating sick monks and local patients. Medical monks learned anatomy from ancient authors, prepared herbal remedies according to traditional recipes, and developed surgical skills through trial and error on real patients. Legal education was necessary because monasteries were involved in complex legal relationships with secular authorities, other religious institutions, and private individuals. Monks who understood canon law, civil law, and local customs could protect their community's interests and serve as advisors to others navigating medieval legal systems. The monastery library was not just a collection of books but an active center of intellectual production where texts were corrected, compiled, and sometimes created. Librarian monks developed sophisticated cataloging systems, preservation techniques, and lending procedures that made their collections accessible to scholars from throughout Europe. Manuscript production was an industrial process that required coordination between scribes, illuminators, bookbinders, and suppliers of parchment, ink, and other materials. A single major manuscript might take years to complete and involve dozens of specialized craftsmen working under tight quality control. The economics of book production were complex. Manuscripts were extremely valuable, making them both sources of income and targets for theft. Monasteries had to balance making their libraries accessible to scholars with protecting their investments in expensive books. Some monasteries specialized in particular types of manuscripts: liturgical books, classical texts, theological works, or historical chronicles, developing reputations that attracted commissions from wealthy patrons willing to pay premium prices for high-quality work. The intellectual life of the monastery was not always harmonious. Scholarly debates could become heated arguments that divided communities, especially when theological questions had political implications or when different schools of thought competed for influence. Some monks were natural scholars who thrived in academic environments, while others found intellectual work frustrating and preferred physical labor or practical crafts. Managing these different personalities and talents required diplomatic skill from monastery leaders. The relationship between faith and reason was a constant source of tension. Monks were supposed to accept church teachings on faith, but scholarly inquiry sometimes led to questions or conclusions that challenged orthodox doctrine. Navigating this tension required intellectual honesty balanced with religious obedience. Access to books and education created hierarchies within monastic communities. Educated monks often received better assignments, more respect, and greater influence in community decisions, which could create resentment among brothers who lacked scholarly skills or opportunities. The monastery's role as a center of medical care extended far beyond treating sick monks. Many monasteries operated hospitals, hospices, or clinics that served surrounding communities, providing the only organized healthcare available to medieval people. Medical monks developed expertise through practical experience, study of classical medical texts, and experimentation with herbal remedies and surgical techniques. Their knowledge was often superior to that available from secular physicians, making monastery infirmaries preferred destinations for serious medical problems. The challenge of providing medical care with limited knowledge and primitive tools required creativity, persistence, and acceptance of frequent failure. monks treating plague victims, battlefield injuries, or chronic diseases had to combine medical intervention with spiritual care, comforting patients and families when cure was impossible. Pharmaceutical preparation was a specialized skill that required knowledge of plants, chemistry, and dosage calculations. Monk pharmacists maintained herb gardens, prepared complex remedies according to traditional recipes, and experimented with new treatments based on their observations of patient responses. Surgical procedures were performed with limited anesthesia, primitive instruments, and high risk of infection. Monk surgeons developed techniques for treating wounds, removing foreign objects, and performing operations that required both medical knowledge and courage to inflict necessary pain on suffering patients. Mental health treatment was primarily spiritual, based on the assumption that psychological problems resulted from sin, demonic influence, or lack of faith. This approach sometimes helped patients, but could also increase guilt and suffering. For those dealing with conditions that had biological rather than spiritual causes, the monastery's agricultural operations were sophisticated enterprises that required extensive knowledge of crops, livestock, weather patterns, and market conditions. Monk farmers developed innovations that improved productivity and introduced new farming techniques to their regions. Crop rotation systems developed in monastery farms helped maintain soil fertility while maximizing yields, supporting larger populations and generating surplus crops for trade. These innovations required long-term planning and careful record-keeping that demonstrated the educational advantages of literate farmers. Livestock breeding programs in monasteries produced improved animals that enhanced both monastery resources and regional agricultural productivity. Monk farmers developed expertise in animal husbandry that made their cattle, sheep, and pigs more valuable than those raised by less knowledgeable farmers. Food preservation techniques developed in monastery kitchens allowed communities to maintain nutrition throughout seasonal variations and occasional crop failures. Monks became experts in smoking meat, making cheese, brewing ale, and storing grain in ways that prevented spoilage and pest infestation. The monastery's economic relationships with surrounding communities were complex and sometimes contentious. As major landowners and employers, monasteries wielded significant economic power that could be used to benefit or exploit local populations. Tenant farmers working monastery lands often received better treatment than those working for secular landlords, benefiting from the monastery's long-term perspective and religious commitment to justice. However, monasteries also needed income to support their religious and charitable activities, creating pressure to maximize profits from agricultural operations. Employment opportunities in monastery workshops, kitchens, and construction projects provided income for local craftsmen and laborers. But wages and working conditions varied depending on the monastery's resources and management philosophy. Market relationships were complicated by religious restrictions on certain types of business practices. Monasteries couldn't engage in obviously usurious lending or other activities considered sinful, but they found creative ways to generate income while technically maintaining religious compliance. The monastery's charitable activities were central to its religious mission but created practical challenges in managing limited resources among unlimited needs. Monasteries were expected to provide food, shelter, and care for travelers, pilgrims, and local poor, but they had to balance generosity with sustainability. Hospitality traditions required monasteries to welcome strangers and provide free accommodation and meals, but this openness made communities vulnerable to abuse by people who took advantage of monastic charity without genuine need. Poor relief programs distributed food, clothing, and other necessities to local people during times of hardship, but monastery resources were not unlimited, forcing difficult decisions about who deserved help and how much aid could be provided. Medical care for indigent patients was a major expense that monasteries absorbed as part of their charitable mission, but treating large numbers of sick, poor people strained both financial resources and medical staff. Educational charity involved teaching local children whose families couldn't afford private tutors, but this created additional work for monk teachers and competition for resources with the monastery's own educational programs. The daily reality of monastic life was shaped by countless small details that determined whether the experience was spiritually enriching or merely the quality of food, comfort of sleeping arrangements, warmth of buildings, and personalities of fellow monks all influenced individual monks' ability to focus on spiritual development, Personal relationships within the monastery were complex and sometimes intense. Monks who lived and worked together for decades developed deep friendships, annoying rivalries, and occasional genuine hatred that had to be managed within the constraints of religious charity and community harmony. Some monks were naturally suited to communal life and thrived in the structured environment of the monastery, while others struggled with the lack of privacy, personal autonomy, and individual expression that monastic life required. The monastery's leadership structure created opportunities for advancement and recognition that could motivate monks to excel in their work. But it also generated competition and political maneuvering that sometimes contradicted spiritual ideals about humility and service. Disciplinary procedures were necessary to maintain order and standards within the community, but they also created tension between individual freedom and collective needs, between mercy and justice, between spiritual guidance and practical punishment. The physical environment of the monastery, its architecture, decoration, and maintenance, reflected both spiritual values and practical necessities. Beautiful churches and comfortable living quarters could enhance spiritual life or distract from it, depending on individual monks' personalities and spiritual development. So there you have it, the complete picture of medieval monastic life in all its complexity, contradiction, and humanity. From the 2 a.m. wake-up calls to the sophisticated business operations, from the profound spiritual experiences to the petty interpersonal conflicts, from the scholarly achievements to the agricultural innovations, monastic communities were far more varied and dynamic than popular stereotypes suggest. These men created institutions that preserved knowledge, advanced human understanding, provided essential services to their communities, and developed models of cooperative living that continue to influence modern society. They weren't perfect. They struggled with the same human weaknesses that challenge everyone, but they committed their lives to ideals that transcended individual comfort and convenience. Whether they were copying ancient texts by candlelight, caring for plague victims, teaching local children to read, or simply trying to maintain spiritual focus while dealing with a leaky roof and insufficient heating, monks were living out their beliefs in ways that shaped the world around them. Their legacy extends far beyond the monastery walls, through the universities they founded, the books they preserved, the agricultural techniques they developed, the medical knowledge they advanced, and the artistic treasures they created. Every time you visit a library, receive medical care, or benefit from educational opportunities, you're experiencing the continuing influence of medieval monastic communities. Thanks for joining me on this complete journey into monastic life. Let me know in the comments what aspect of medieval monastery living surprised you most: the business operations, the educational mission, the agricultural innovations, or just the sheer human complexity of it all. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed exploring the surprisingly multifaceted world of these dedicated religious communities. Until next time, sleep well and be grateful. You don't have to get up for matins at 2 a.m. every single night for the rest of your life.